You're listening to Why We Do What We Do.
Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your patriotic host, Abraham.
And I am your dissenting host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast, and we like to talk about all the things that humans and animals do, and maybe someday we'll even talk about what plants do. Today we're talking about something that humans do, but only in a very small part of the world, mostly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And this is something that was so pervasive, and I feel not pervasive, that's not the word, but like it was something that was so ingrained in my like daily routine coming up as a child that I think it's something that you almost like it's so ever present. You don't think about why you do that thing. So I'm excited to talk about this today.
Yeah. Before we get into our topic, I'll say really quickly that if you like the show, if you'd like to support us, you can pick up some merch at our merch store, join us over on Patreon, tell a friend, leave us a rating and review, subscribe, create a Why We Do What We Do flag that you then pledge allegiance to every day. I'll talk about more in detail about the ways you can support us at the end of this discussion today. But today, this episode is going to be published on a particular day that many people will recognize for a day of celebration, maybe a week of celebration, maybe even a month of celebration.
Yeah, so today is Paranormal Day, which I really like. If you get a chance, you should watch the movie Paranorman, which is a lot of fun.
That is a fun movie, definitely. It is also National Garden Meditation Day, so you can find a nice garden to do some mindfulness meditation practice in.
I think that's good. It's National Two Different Colored Shoes Day, which, I mean, I guess technically if your shoes are not one solid color, aren't they two different colored at least?
I think that could be one interpretation of that for sure. It's also Write a Review Day. This could be helping businesses or customers or both if you leave a review about an establishment that you have patronized.
I have written exactly one bad review in my life, and it's because the hotel room that I stayed in was splattered with blood.
Oh my God. That's intense.
Yeah, it was. I don't know what it was, but that was the only bad review. So I would say for write a review day, maybe write a good review. Maybe do that. Be kind.
Yeah, I prefer to write good reviews. Yeah.
My
silence is my damning review.
Yeah. It's like, ooh, I'm not going to say anything. It's National Lumpy Rug Day, which I guess.
Sure. National Lawyer Well-Being Week. So for the mental health of lawyers who have a job to do, and occasionally, that job is to help people.
Occasionally. It's also Go Diaper Free Week. So, have fun with that.
And for those of you celebrating, it is National Barbecue Month. That's a lot of barbecue, but hopefully you enjoy it.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and pull out my barbecue seitan and enjoy this. It's also National Bike Month, so go ride. I think that's fun.
And it is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, which I think is a great one to recognize for those celebrating. And I'll also say that it's sort of unofficially, I think, Star Wars Appreciation Month. And tomorrow, the day after this publishes, and maybe when our listener is currently listening, is May the 4th, which obviously May the 4th be with you. Mm-hmm. Star Wars Day. Yeah.
And then the day after is Revenge of the 5th.
That's right. Yeah. So for those celebrating, happy almost Star Wars Day today.
Yeah, I like it.
Star Wars Month. Unofficially.
It's the best. I love it.
But we are actually talking about something that I think was really interesting to me. I'll sort of give the context of how I decided it would be a useful exercise to learn about and talk about what we're talking about today. And if you're listening to us from the United States, you'll likely recognize the sound of many people reciting an oath of faith to their government.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
So as you could hear from that lovely recording, the Pledge of Allegiance very commonly said in the United States, and it goes like this, which when it's written out, it actually looks like the cadence is off from how you will have heard it and probably said it.
Yeah.
So just reading it straight, it goes like this. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Although it's usually said with a very paced cadence.
Right.
Which you sort of heard in that clip that we played.
Absolutely. This phrase, this oath, is something that U.S. public school children and elected officials will recite thousands of times over their lives. Abraham here did it from memory before the episode and for this episode. He tried to get me to do it, and I missed one word. I was so close, but I had realized that I had given up saying the pledge in maybe 7th or 8th grade. It's been many, many years.
Yeah, that was a felonious offense in your neck of the woods.
It's a whole thing here. I mean, but, we also have the gator oath and swamp oaths that we have to do. So it's hard to remember all of them sometimes.
So many oaths of allegiance to various destructive entities. Anyway, it got us thinking that it's kind of uncommon for democracies to institutionalize some oath of fealty from its constituents. Or is it? Well, I wanted to know, how common is the Pledge of Allegiance around the world, and how did it get started in the United States? And if it is in other countries around the world, what kind of characteristics might those countries share that would say this is a country that's likely to have its citizens routinely say a Pledge of Allegiance to that country?
I do appreciate the way that this question is worded. How common is the Pledge of Allegiance around the world? Thinking that other people think that the 4th of July is celebrated everywhere too.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's worth asking, is there an oath of allegiance or a pledge of allegiance within those specific countries that they look at? And you're going to find, I think, some surprising things about this. As we were going through the notes, I think there's some stuff that's kind of maybe not what you would expect about this.
Exactly. So let's dig into this. And a lot of this is going to be the history, the background of where this came from, because I think that it's pretty interesting if you look into it. So let's, of course, define our terms. What is a Pledge of Allegiance? I found a couple of different sources, but they mostly seem to agree that a Pledge of Allegiance, or an Oath of Allegiance, as it's more formally known, is and I'm going to quote here, oath whereby a citizen acknowledges a duty of allegiance and swears loyalty towards the new host country or monarch, end quote. And that's from csglobalpartners.com.
Now, although this is a generic definition, it is largely known because of the U.S. fervent performance of this oath and heavy politicization and rhetoric around this. So this is something, though, I think when we start talking about this becomes a loaded thing, because I remember this being such an important part of our days coming up in public schools.
Yeah, and you just see it everywhere. It's so ubiquitous that, just as you said, many people might not even stop to think about, is it normal to pledge allegiance to a flag? Do they do this in every country? Does it sound like ours? And it is a somewhat uniquely American thing, not entirely, but the extent to which we implement it is way beyond what you'll see in most other places. So, as some events unfolding in time here, in 1988, in the United States, the then President Ronald Reagan, a Republican, was ending his second and final term as the President of the United States. And as Vice President, George H.W. Bush, or George Bush Sr., was running to fill the seat of president in 1988.
Now, at the time, his Democratic opponent was Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts, who Bush publicly successfully criticized because Dukakis had vetoed a bill that would have required public school teachers, but not private school teachers, to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, which Dukakis vetoed on the grounds that it violated First Amendment free speech, which we're going to unpack some of that as well. I think that's going to be an important one to discuss.
Yes. Now, ironically, during all of this, Bush Sr. did not actually seem to know the words to the Pledge of Allegiance himself, but his campaign manager made him memorize them so that he would be able to use this attack and then demonstrate that he could say the Pledge of Allegiance. But I think that he first called out Dukakis as a political move and then didn't actually know the Pledge of Allegiance himself.
Yeah, I could see that being a really easy kind of target, right? Something that people would understand, saying that this person doesn't want your kids to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and people going, "Oh no," and not liking that specific thing. I could see that's a very easy rallying point.
Yeah, and to be clear, we're talking about Bush as the one who did not, the conservative, the Republican, was the one who did not seem to know the Pledge of Allegiance at the time. Dukakis was defending the lack of requiring a pledge as a free speech issue. And this was actually long after this had already been talked about as a free speech issue, which we'll get to in a little bit.
Right. Now, in 2019, a sixth grader in Florida, because of course it's Florida, you couldn't pull any other Any other examples? You had to pull Florida. I mean, I think it's just easy. It's low-hanging fruit. I mean, if you're doing research for a podcast and you need something kind of off the cuff, then yeah, I guess Florida is the place to go. Now, the sixth grader in Florida decided not to say the Pledge of Allegiance. The substitute teacher at the time asked the student to find another place to live, which seems like a very rational response to that. The student apparently said something that the substitute took as a threat, and the student, again a sixth grader, was arrested. So it snowballed into some probably unnecessary problems.
Yeah, the conditions under which you put somebody in handcuffs, not repeating an oath of fealty to a country or a flag, does not seem like the appropriate one. Now, as I said, in the news report, they suggested that the substitute claimed that he was threatened. Another report that I found, a different news report, said that the police specifically arrested him for, I think, causing a disturbance or being disruptive, something like that. I think it was causing a disturbance, which also does not feel like the kind of thing one should be put in handcuffs for. Like, taking away someone's freedom to that extent seems like, and like actually arresting them, processing them through law for something that they didn't say, it seems like, or even just honestly causing a disturbance like that seems like such a pathetically low offense to get so butthurt about.
Right. I mean, it's Florida, so I'm not surprised. My daughter had a similar experience like not too long ago where the substitute teacher lectured her on respect because she refused to stand up for the pledge. Like, she just was like, I'm not doing this. It was right after Roe v. Wade had come out, and my daughter gets really passionate about social justice issues. And she was like, why would I say the pledge right now when I am unhappy with the state of the country? So she did do that, and the substitute did give her and the entire class a lecture about respect and respecting the flag and the country and all that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can understand that. And I'm glad she was not arrested, because that is ridiculous to be putting kids in handcuffs for not saying a thing. Or even, again, like most of the stuff just seems like it's not an arrest-worthy offense.
Not at all.
Anyway, moving on. In the United States, during the 2020 election, the bipartisan city council of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, unanimously voted to cease reciting the Pledge of Allegiance at the start of every single one of its meetings. That was the thing that they passed.
Interesting.
Now, if you heard that, do you think you would characterize a city council removing the Pledge of Allegiance from their meetings only and no other part of any other state dealings at all, or city dealings for that matter? Would you regard that as a siege against the Pledge of Allegiance? Maybe if you were stupider than a covered pile of rocks?
Now enter the former president and Florida man template, Donald Trump, who, in response to the city council decision, tweeted, quote, "The Pledge of Allegiance to our great country in St. Louis Park, Minnesota is under siege," end quote. So conclusion, covered pile of rocks, much smarter than that tweet.
Going back a little bit in time, in 2008, when the then governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, was asked whether under God, as part of the Pledge of Allegiance, was offensive, she responded, quote, "If it was good enough for our founding fathers, then it is good enough for me," end quote. So, point being, from all of those examples, it's clear that the pledge is a highly politically charged phenomenon with heavy support from the conservative, right-wing politicians and other sort of conservative talking heads. And if you thought you were going to make it through the day without having to listen to a single ad, I'm sorry to disappoint you, because here they are. We've been talking about the history of the controversy around the Pledge of Allegiance a little bit in the United States, mostly just highlighting some examples of things that people have said and done in their fervent support of the Pledge of Allegiance. So let's continue our history here.
So it might be of great interest then that the American flags were actually pretty uncommon in public schools, but some enterprising liberal businessmen, James Upham and Daniel Ford, decided to start selling American flags to American schools and were extremely successful in doing so. Could you imagine building your empire on selling flags to schools?
Kinda, I guess. I don't know how I would sleep at night, but
Sure.
And so these two, they put together a national program to celebrate Columbus Day, and they solicited help from the National Education Association to support their Boston-based National Family Magazine in this endeavor. So it was kind of this coordinated effort of we're going to get a bunch of flags out there. We're going to, through our magazine, we're going to sort of direct how the ceremony will go. And everyone, all these school kids across the country are going to recognize Columbus. And it seems like this is largely to sell stuff was their plan.
Right. So the magazine hired Francis Bellamy, not to be confused with Bill Bellamy, the MTV VJ. Francis Bellamy is a radical Christian socialist famous for such speeches and sermons as, quote, the socialism of the primitive church and, quote, Jesus the Socialist, who supported the idea of nationalized everything under one government, namely the economy, taxation, and a national education system.
So that's Francis Bellamy.
Yeah, Jesus the Socialist. I like that.
Yeah, I thought that was really fun. So for the 1892 Columbus Day program that they were all orchestrating, Bellamy wrote the Pledge of Allegiance. This is 105 years after the Constitution was written, FYI. He may not have actually been the person who authored the pledge. There's some controversy about that, and we'll talk about that more a little bit later in this discussion. But for now, all of the sources that I found, except for a couple, were very convinced that it was Francis Bellamy. So we'll use him as our main talking point, and then we'll talk about the controversy later. As part of the program, the pledge was to be accompanied by a stiff right-handed salute. And so we're going to read his instructions and the accompanying pledge at the time. So this is what was published in the magazine for people to do during this Columbus Day celebration.
All right, so here are the instructions. At a signal from the principal, the pupils in ordered ranks, hands to the side, face the flag. Another signal is given. Every pupil gives the flag the military salute, right hand lifted, palm downward, to align with the forehead and close to it. Standing thus, all repeat together, slowly, I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At the words, to my flag, the right hand is extended gracefully, palm upward, toward the flag, and remains in this gesture until the end of the affirmation, whereupon all hands immediately drop to the side.
So those astute listeners may have noticed that version of the pledge was shorter than the one that we heard at the beginning, and that is because some things about the pledge changed. But let's continue through our timeline here. This was 1892 that was published, and that was the sort of thing, that the celebration that they did. In 1922, the Ku Klux Klan, also simply abbreviated as the KKK, had become a political power in Oregon and had adopted the Pledge of Allegiance for themselves. So they thought this was a good idea too.
Yeah.
And anything that they think is a good idea.
Yeah. Don't be on that side. Now, wait. There's a question. What if an immigrant is pledging allegiance and thinks that the part when they say my flag is in reference to their homeland? That will not do. So in 1923, the part that said my flag was replaced with the flag of the United States of America.
Absolutely. During World War II, that salute that they did, where they held their stiff arm outright with their palm up, was considered too similar to the Nazi salute because it was just one 180-degree flip away from being the Nazi salute, and
Right.
was changed to placing the hand over the heart during the pledge instead. To which I can kind of imagine the KKK probably responded irately as an alteration of history because, they love Nazis and knew that they shouldn't say so out loud at the time.
Uh-huh.
That's my guess anyway.
Yeah. They were probably very disappointed in that decision.
Yeah.
Like they were going, oh, come on, man. Like that. I imagine a lot of them did that. In 1954, under urgings of the Knights of Columbus and in the context of the Red Scare of communism, Dwight D. Eisenhower asked Congress to add "under God" to the pledge, which they, of course, did. As a side note, the Knights of Columbus is an international all-male Catholic fraternal service order largely involved in communal support for its members, a large amount of philanthropic activities, and, of course, political maneuvering, as you would imagine Knights of Columbus would do, or any sort of knight would do. Now, for those of you keeping track, this is 167 years after the Constitution was written. Even the great-grandchildren of the founding fathers are long dead. So there are no ties to this at this point in time.
So there you have it. A socialist wrote the pledge during Jim Crow after Reconstruction for a magazine as part of a marketing strategy disguised as a Columbus Day celebration over 100 years after the founding of our country. That is the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States in a nutshell.
Yeah, yeah. Also, big fans of the original pledge, the KKK. So remember that too.
Yes. And other very, very super conservative groups as well. That's actually part of why the My Flag thing got changed, was at the urging of one of those, something called like 100% American was their campaign or something like that.
That sounds about right.
So they are the big fan of changing that. Okay, so now the question becomes, so we gave the history of the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States, but one of the things that we billboarded at the top of this is the question, how common is this in other countries? So we looked around to find, are there other countries that also require some kind of oath or pledge of allegiance to their flag or their country or their leader or whatever?
Right. So we found at least 24 other countries that require an oath or a pledge of allegiance, but only when becoming a citizen or being sworn into public office, particularly by a judge. So it's not built into like a specific education system as part of like an everyday routine.
Yeah. So for those oaths, just as a quick summary, as I said, there's 24 of them, so I'm not going to go through them all. They all have very similar characteristics for the most part. The longest by far is the United States, which includes much more than just that pledge that we read. It has all this to do with becoming a citizen and like duty and obligation. The shortest pledge is Israel's, which is simply, I declare I will be a loyal national of the state of Israel, end quote. And that's their whole pledge. Very succinct.
Right.
And my favorites was Belgium's, which was, quote, I declare my desire to acquire the Belgian nationality and to submit myself to the Constitution, the laws of Belgium, and to the Convention of the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, end quote. I was like, there was only one pledge that had an allusion to a commitment of human rights and freedoms, and that was Belgium. And you might have noticed that neither of those two use the word God in any sense of the word, even in Israel, where they're arguably one of the most religious places in the world.
Super interesting. Now, only the Netherlands and UK include a reference to by God or a similar sentiment, although many include an optional so help me God at the end. And I think that's kind of wonderful that there's like an optional part of the oath.
There's several of them that have optional bits that are like in brackets that sort of like choose to say this if you want to.
Choose your own oath. I like that.
Okay, so as I said, most of these oaths have to do with someone who's becoming a citizen. They don't even have to memorize it. You know, they come to the country, however they get there, they're going through the Citizens Are Us gates, and they are asked to simply read this pledge, or even sometimes they'll just read it quietly to themselves and they'll sign a document saying that they read it. And that's all that they have to do. They've even started allowing people to do this virtually during the pandemic. That became a thing, as people could become citizens by swearing an oath over like Zoom or Skype or something. Anyway, that was all people becoming citizens. What about having students in classrooms, have as part of their daily ritual, salute the flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance? Well, one country that does this is North Korea, famously one of the most oppressive dictatorships in the world. They require their students to say the Pledge of Allegiance.
Ooh, okay. So making sure that we've just as we're exploring this, just prepare yourselves to be uncomfortable. The Philippines, which recently left one alt-right despotic dictator of a president, specifically this really kind of troublesome person.
Yeah.
For the Marcos family, with a history as an oppressive and brutal military totalitarian ruling family who managed to rewrite history so people forgot how corrupt and devastating their family rule had been, the Philippines also requires their students to pledge allegiance.
China, which is a Marxist, what I've also seen described as Leninist communist state, also requires a Pledge of Allegiance.
All right. Iran, not particularly known for their freedoms and respect for human rights, also requires a Pledge of Allegiance.
And then, interestingly, dramatically breaking from the theme of most of those countries, India also requires a Pledge of Allegiance.
Okay. All right. So at least, 1 out of, I guess, 5 ain't bad.
Sure. 20% life. Live that 20% life.
Yeah. I mean, and you might be going, well, where does the United States fall in there? I think you can take a guess where we're starting to lean. Another thing to think about, too, is Hitler actually required all soldiers and civil servants to swear an oath to him personally, which is, one, indicative of a cult leader, but two, maybe something that we don't want to mock or imitate. We don't want to maybe take a page from his book.
Yeah, worth at least considering. Some other monarchs and dictators around the world and throughout history have required an oath of allegiance at some point, but it's really it's not that common. It's just not a very common thing to do. I even saw that even in the entire most Sovietness of Soviet histories, they did not require a Pledge of Allegiance from their citizens. Although I did find one oath that was ascribed to, I want to say it was Lenin. No, it was Stalin. It was Joseph Stalin. But I don't know that it was one that was actually supposed to be recited by the citizens, the comrades, if you will, of the country.
Right.
All that is to say, a Pledge of Allegiance is fairly uncommon if you think about it. But the most currently patriotic thing you can do is listen to capitalism's cancerous rattle, the advertisement break. Okay, we're back. We've been talking about all the countries, the few, that do require a ritualistic recitation of some kind of oath or pledge of fealty to the country.
It's probably worth looking at the United States specifically, because one of the things that the United States prides itself on is state rights. I mean, there was a whole civil war about that specific thing. And so you're going to find, and that's actually one of the more interesting things about the United States, is that every state kind of has their own stuff that they deal with. So in the United States specifically, a 1943 Supreme Court ruling, West Virginia versus Barnett, determined that no one could be compelled or punished by school or government to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So this goes all the way back to 1943, during World War II, where patriotism was probably something that was like a really prime currency. They really wanted everybody to be really, really patriotic at the time. And so the Supreme Court was like, no, we can't make people do that.
Yeah.
Which I think is actually pretty important. I think that's a really important ruling.
Well, and I believe that they specifically cited the First Amendment of the United States Constitution for the protection and guarantee of free speech that cannot be oppressed as the reason. Although I will say that there was also, if I'm remembering correctly in this case, it may have been this case or a different case, part of where this got started was some Jehovah's Witnesses who wouldn't say a Pledge of Allegiance because it was against their religion, and they got in really big trouble. And I think that may have been this case, but that one also was one that had them, they basically went to a court saying that they have religious freedom, the right to practice their religion as they see fit, and that may mean not pledging an oath of allegiance to a flag. So that was honored, like that was upheld, that they had that right in this country.
Yeah, pretty interesting.
Although this ruling happened in 1943, 46 or 47, depending on who you ask, apparently, of the 50 United States have some requirement to say the pledge built into their state laws. Although almost all of them have some sort of opt-out policy where you do not have to say the pledge if you don't want to. The requirement for most of these states where there is a requirement is that time be set aside for the pledge to occur, although actually implementing it is not necessarily required in many of those places. Now, if you want to opt out, some places, such as Florida and Texas, require a parent or guardian to provide signed consent that a child may opt out of saying the pledge. And in some states, the children themselves can opt out, but they are required to remain, quote unquote, respectfully silent. And in some, which I think is New Jersey, must remove any headwear such as a hat, while also standing at attention quietly and respectfully, as they say.
The hat thing is interesting. I think we should probably eventually do maybe even like a mini on like why removing hats is such a big deal. Because one time I went in for jury duty and a sheriff actually grabbed me because I would not take off my hat when I was addressing the judge.
Wow.
Because I was like, I don't want to be here. I don't respect this court. I was being a shithead. But like it was one of those things where I wouldn't take my hat. And he grabbed my hands, pulled them out of my pockets and made me take my hat off.
Wow. That sounds like a free country right there.
Yeah. You know, DeLand, Florida. Anyway, so when we talked about these states, the states that don't have a requirement, I'm actually pretty shocked by this. Some of them I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. The other two I'm like, that doesn't make any sense. They must have missed that, or maybe the person that wrote the law doesn't know what a flag is. But Nebraska, Hawaii, Vermont, and Wyoming do not specifically have requirements for a recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance. I was particularly surprised about Nebraska and Wyoming.
Yeah.
Hawaii and Vermont totally makes sense. But the other two, I was really shocked by those.
Yeah. I kind of think it's a free speech thing there too, but I'm not totally sure. What I found was that Georgia, Kansas, Illinois, New Mexico, Nevada, Massachusetts, California, and Delaware do require the pledge, but do not have a clear exemption policy. And many of these places, they simply leave it to the oversight of the school districts to have a policy. So it's not even states' rights, it's then district rights at that point.
Yeah. Now, just to kind of talk about how much of a hot button topic this still is, just in February of 2023, the Arizona House of Representatives have passed the most draconian attempt at a requirement for all school children up to the age of 18 say the pledge. Now, again, the requirement is to, quote, set aside time for the pledge. That's what you see in a lot of places. Although they added, each student shall recite the pledge during that time. They do offer the parental exemption, but the law is written in such a way that even if it passes the state government, it's so blatantly illegal and unconstitutional, it likely won't last long if it's challenged by literally anyone in a court of law.
Yeah.
And so I don't think this will be something that goes through, but you're finding more and more and more people are getting bold with these really restrictive things, for the sake of freedom in their nation.
They champion it as a parents' rights issue, and I find that kind of ironic, but that is kind of the theme, right? It's you take away someone's liberty and then you say it's because you want to preserve liberty.
Right.
That's like a thing that's been going on a lot. And so I find it ironic and deeply distressing that continues to be the case and that people are just all for it. They're like, yeah, I would like this authoritarian government that forces citizens to pledge an oath to it. I think you would find that even people who are a fan of the current government would fight for the right to not pledge allegiance to that government. And I definitely think the people who are not a fan of the current government, if you were to ask them to swear a pledge for the government and they didn't want to, I would also respect their right to not want to do that thing.
Sure.
And I think that they would probably appreciate the fact that they could have the autonomy to say, like, I don't like what this country is doing right now. I'm not going to pledge allegiance to it. And that I would say, like, okay, that is perfectly within your rights to do. Because you shouldn't have to swear to, like, imagine if, like, Joe Biden specifically came out and tried to pass a law that was like, you have to swear a pledge of allegiance to me. Like, how upset that would make the conservatives, and rightfully so. I also would not want to swear a pledge of allegiance to him,
sure,
even being someone who I think is pretty obviously left-leaning.
Right.
But, like, I think that if Donald Trump had come out as president and said, you must swear, a pledge of allegiance to me personally, that they would have seen that as okay, and even like, yes, I'll definitely do that thing. And that is why I think it's kind of weird where we see the weird split in where people are with this.
Absolutely. So I think we should probably get into why people do this, right? We got to answer the question of why we do what we do. So let's start exploring, I think, why people actually swear an oath of allegiance. And most of the time, we see this when people are changing citizenship in a new country. Soldiers might be required to do it, and elected officials will often pledge when taking an office. So it makes sense as part of like a formal process or formal transition of power almost, or transition of status.
Yeah.
You see that kind of happen in those spaces.
Yeah, transition of status. And I think that largely it is meant to, in those spaces, to communicate the due diligence of saying, like, look, if we're going to take this person in and shelter them, we want to make sure they're not trying to sabotage us and do destruction, even though an oath guarantees nothing at all, right?
No.
Yeah. The very act of doing it is both symbolically relevant, and I think it's meant to show, like, we're at least going through the motions of asking this of people, but I think it's also meant to try and elicit a sense of obligation from those people. And if you think, like, look, you're going to be here, I want you to feel the weight of the responsibility that we're putting on your shoulders by saying this out loud and saying it yourself. And so that's kind of where I see the rationale for why people want to do this in those situations where they're trying to have someone, they're giving them more power by they're moving into an elected official position, or a judge or something of that nature, or they're becoming a participant in that government.
Yeah, absolutely. So another reason why is that people do this as a daily or ritualistic kind of recitation of the oath. But the thing is that's actually fairly uncommon. It's really only happening in the United States or some of those other countries we mentioned, North Korea, Iran, and those places. So that's one reason why people might do it, but it's actually not a common thing. Even though in the United States, we have had that experience from the time that we got into kindergarten or maybe even preschool all the way up to the time we graduated high school at the very least.
Yeah.
I think that's actually really fascinating because that's such a common experience for Americans.
Yes, yeah, it's completely ubiquitous. You would just not see it. Like, you could almost not avoid it if you were participating in any of those public institutions at all. Now, many, if not most people from other countries see the American devotion to this process as odd to the point of being a little creepy. And they point out that having small children swear loyalty to their government feels weird and kind of culty and maybe a little brainwashy. And I think that if we didn't have this and we saw some other supposedly democratic country doing this, I feel like we would feel the same way.
I think I agree with this, and I think about this a lot because when I started thinking about like the pledge itself and why people say it, I started thinking about how it's become kind of a rote response.
Yeah.
Like how it just like became kind of like such a routine that you don't even really think about what it means or why somebody might say it. I remember when I was younger, when I started really thinking about what was being said, I was like, this is weird, and started really kind of like trying to unpack the elements of it. As you start doing that, like you do it for so long and so often, it's just you don't even think twice about doing it.
Yeah, I had a very similar experience. It was very rote response for a long time for me. And then I started realizing and thinking about what I was saying. And there were parts of it that I decided I was not going to say anymore, and I would just be silent during those parts. But I don't think I completely gave up on it until pretty much near the very end of my public school life, if you will. And then it was maybe a little late for that to have much of an impact. But yeah, it is a very, very ingrained response after the, hundreds and hundreds or thousands of times you've done it. By the time you are nearing the end of your political or your public school, not political school, public school.
Yeah. As I was thinking about it, one of the weirdest things, like one of the weirdest parts of it was the latest edition. I don't know if you've seen the latest edition in the pledge that they've started doing. They added this part where it says one podcast under ads. And I thought that was kind of a weird addition. So maybe we should review that.
Okay, we've been talking about why people swear an oath of allegiance and what might be going on there. So we talked about why people would swear if they're coming to a country or they're moving into an elected position or that sort of thing. But what would be the purpose of daily practice of this ritual? Well, largely it seems to occur in, I think, the most stringently in these really highly conservative places with authoritarian leanings. And I mean that around the world, right? Like if you look at places where it's required,
right,
and it's a daily ritualistic thing, it's in these pretty authoritarian countries for most of them, except for maybe one. And presumably as a gesture of A, symbolic patriotism, and B, indoctrination to influence future actions in a way that is loyal to the state, if you will.
Right. Now, a cheekier critique would be to include that the loyalty should be unquestioned and followed blindly, and that the symbolic patriotism is due to a pathetic, fragile ego that needs to be constantly reminded of loyalty, or else they will melt down into a temper tantrum. And I think when you kind of think of it like that, from like the fragile ego standpoint of a nation, where it's just like basically just somebody going, tell me you like me every single day.
Yeah.
If you want to interpret it that way, you can. Another side of that too, I think, when you kind of talk about like daily ritual and daily kind of like practices, there are lots of different things that we do on a daily basis that are not this. They're not like country oriented. They might be spiritually oriented or maybe personally or familiar, like family oriented. They may be one of those things. And we don't typically question those things because they may have like some type of like well-being or benefit for that person or maybe for the social circumstances they're in. But this doesn't seem to have that either. Right? We're just kind of like, okay, here's like something we do, and then we kind of move on, and it doesn't really change behavior or like impact that person's daily world in a really meaningful way.
It feels very performative, and it feels performative to the point to appease the people who would have the reaction that you have experienced with your daughter and yourself, where it's being lectured about being respectful and being told that if you don't want to pledge allegiance, you should have to move out of the country. And like all of these outcomes of that sort of thing, that again, it's like, why are you so offended by the fact that someone doesn't want to swear an oath of allegiance to a country that they do not respect where that country is going or at the time? Also, if you care at all about freedom and the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression and our First Amendment in the Constitution, I'm surprised that more people wouldn't more staunchly defend that right to choose to use that free speech in a way that is oftentimes simply remaining silent, or they're kneeling or they're sitting.
Right.
And again, if they're doing those things, they're not harming anybody. They're not doing anything other than exercising their free speech right. And I think we'll talk about this here in a moment, but isn't it great that they live in a country where they can exercise their free speech right?
that's the beauty of this thing and this place that we live. You know, we're very fortunate that like we can do that without sort of any repercussions.
Exactly. Otherwise, so that seems to be why there is the reason behind why we might say an oath of allegiance. We're becoming a citizen, or we are trying to assure the very fragile egos of those who can't be not told that you're loyal to them every day. Otherwise, it does seem to serve very little purpose to do it in such a ritualistic fashion. I think arguably, it actually does have the effect that you mentioned already, that potentially it becomes a response that we do so rotely that we're not even thinking during it, and it means nothing to us because we do it too much. That is an actual technique used in psychology to help people to essentially have something not become conscious to them anymore, is to become so automatic at it that you don't even realize you're doing it.
Yeah.
And that is a process to help with certain psychological issues, is to like break it down by having repeated exposure and weakening the effect. And so one could argue that the ritualistic recitation of this actually weakens the effect that it would have if you were otherwise do so in a more, I guess, intentional way.
Absolutely. I think you nailed it there. So one thing we wanted to kind of go back to is this idea that the pledge wasn't written by the person that claims, or that it was attributed to. So the authorship itself may not actually belong to Francis Bellamy. New York Times, the only source for this claim that we could find, reported on an article in which a journalist reported finding a newspaper clipping with the pledge 3 months before Francis Bellamy's was published. So, you know, it's one of those things that could possibly be lost to history. So it's worth maybe some further investigation, but this is what we understand of it right now.
Yes, Francis Bellamy swore under many affidavits that he was the author, but there was this clipping that this journalist, or maybe historian, maybe historical journalist, I don't remember now, found, and they had a really hard time justifying, like, how was this Pledge of Allegiance published when the Pledge of Allegiance hadn't yet been published? And it was about 3 months beforehand. And to give a little more context, because it's kind of a weird story. So the author we've been describing, his name is Francis Bellamy. The person who they think may have written this was a 6th grader named Frank Bellamy, which is very close to Francis Bellamy.
Oh, weird.
Yes. And they think that the newspaper clipping suggests that he wrote it into that same magazine, and that maybe Francis saw it and either consciously or unconsciously copied it and then took credit. And that's what the historian has suggested is the case. Now, as I said, everywhere you look, they have essentially just declared that Francis Bellamy authored this. The Library of Congress has this. Many places with like codified official government documents have written down that Francis Bellamy is the official author. And the only source that I could find was this New York Times article. But that is not to say it's not true. It's possible that it's just something that's being currently uncovered. We don't know. So there seems to be some evidence to question Bellamy's originality in authoring the Pledge of Allegiance.
You know, I think the weirdest part of that story is thinking about a 6-year-old named Frank.
I think it was a 6th grader, so I think like a 12-year-old.
Oh, okay. Either way, a 12-year-old named Frank. Also strange to think about. That's a very feels like a very adult name. Like I picture a kid like with a stogie in his mouth, being like, that guy he took credit for my thing that I wrote. He's wearing like a press hat, and he's got a well ironed suit that he's wearing to 6th grade gym playing dodgeball or something.
Yeah, sure.
What a time to be alive. All right, now is part of this kind of discussion. I think you have to kind of think of the country you want to live in, and the kind of place that forces its citizens to constantly be swearing to it, or swearing its allegiance, or swearing at fealty. Like, you have to kind of take a second to stop and go, well, where am I living, and why is this something that is required of the place that I live? We see this kind of place, or see this type of thing where we see people kneeling during the national anthem as an exercise of free speech, and people being livid about it.
Yeah.
And not being okay with that, as we have something like the pledge and the national anthem as like a respected symbol, or supposed to be a respected symbol, but also the respected idea of freedom of speech within that. And so it's really fascinating to kind of think about that dichotomy and why people struggle with both of those things.
Yeah. And just thinking about, like, if you were to hear in a country that some citizen, let's just say North Korea, a citizen there like refused to pledge their allegiance to the government, or a particular figure in the government, and then they were punished in some way. Maybe had to leave their job. Maybe they were kicked out of the country. Maybe they're even arrested, what have you. Like, we would look at that and say, that makes sense in a place like North Korea where you have a vicious dictatorship. And then think, like, do we want to live in that same country? Do we want to live in a country where we supposedly want to protect people's freedoms, and then when they simply refuse to, say an oath, that they're then punished by the government for not swearing their fealty? And I think that if we want to say that we respect the fact that we're in a liberal, democratic society where we have guaranteed freedoms and liberties, that you just don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to say that people have free speech and then try and take that away from them when they exercise it to criticize you.
Right. It hit me that there's a really clear example of how this can get twisted and go wrong as far as ritualistic kind of blind engagement with this type of thing. And I think because I recently read not too long ago 1984, and the one thing they would do in the book was they would do the 2-minute tate. And the 2-minute tate was this ritualistic thing that there was time set aside to engage in this behavior that was socially acceptable and something that every citizen did. And if you didn't participate in it, you were kind of identified and targeted as somebody who was not part of the society, and you might be a problem. And so that's kind of what happens here, right? If I don't stand for the pledge, I mean, it's not nearly as bad as 1984, but if I don't stand for the pledge, then I am targeted as somebody who doesn't belong, or maybe has a nefarious type of approach, when the truth is I just don't believe in saying it. But I appreciate that I'm allowed to do that.
Yeah, and that's exactly the great segue into, I think, the sort of main conclusion here is that we have the freedom in this country to disagree, or to basically to criticize our government. We live in a place where you can criticize your government. The places in the country where you can't criticize your government are scary, dangerous, horrible places to be. You do not want to live in those countries.
Right.
We appreciate that freedom here, and we don't want to take it for granted, but we do have to be able to criticize our government if we're going to live in a place that boasts having the freedom of speech.
Yeah, we are allowed to love and appreciate the place that we're at and still love it enough to be able to criticize it so that we can see it do better.
Yeah.
That's really ultimately what we're trying to do. And that's a perfectly acceptable thing. I don't want to say I love the country. I appreciate where I'm at, and I love what it could stand for and what it could be. And I just want to see it get there, and I want to see it do better. And so I think this is one of those things that we have to protect is, if you want to say the pledge, say it. But if you don't want to say the pledge, then we have to protect that right too.
Yeah. And good leaders appreciate criticism because that's how they become even better.
Exactly.
And there are so few of them, it seems like.
Yes.
So I think my major take-home point is that, from as far as we can tell, the Pledge of Allegiance in the United States is very unique. It is one of the very few places in the world that you would ritualistically be asked to consistently and continuously swear allegiance to a flag as it represents your government. And it is, the current group in which we're running contains mostly dictators and, somewhat ironically, communists. So if that's sort of your bag, that's the crowd you're hanging with right now.
Right. One of my favorite things about this, or one of the more interesting things I thought about this, was it has become such a rote thing that people don't really think about it being odd, or thinking about it's become such an ingrained part of practice and kind of daily routines.
Yeah.
That you just don't even think about where it came from. I had no idea the original pledge required a salute and then the yin-yang Nazi salute to go along with it, right? It's a hand over your heart type of situation that got changed because of that, because of World War II. And I think that's a super fascinating kind of thing about this thing that we have done for hundreds, almost 100 years now.
Yeah, exactly right. And because it's more recent, the current iteration of all of this is more recent than people might think, going back to the point of was it good enough for our founding fathers? I'm them and their grandchildren had been dead long before this discussion ever even took place. You would not find a lot of flags around before this, but someone noticed that and said, hey, we can make a buck selling flags. And so now there's flags everywhere.
Yeah, I also think of when people kind of go well, the founding fathers like this. I'm bring one of them here today and watch them just their mind is going to melt.
Yeah.
That's the thing is you can't do that. When they go into a store and they can't buy pantaloons, they're going to lose their shit.
I think they would not understand any of what's going on in any of the country at all. I think it would be entirely lost.
No, to be fair, I don't either. But it is it's a different type of thing.
Yeah. The problems that we have are so beyond the scope of problems that they would have experienced or faced or thought that could even be possible back then.
Yeah.
And honestly, who cares? Who cares? Like they did a great job kicking things off, a terrible job in some ways, but a really good job in other ways. And like all we have is where we're at currently to try and continue to do better and allow this country to evolve to what it's going to be. And generally, as we are participants in this species, to allow our species to continue to evolve and become better into what that we're hopefully going to be, which I hope is something good.
Absolutely. 100% agree.
Well, let's finish this up with some recommendations.
Recommendations.
I am recommending a Netflix movie that came out relatively recently. So Murder Mystery 2, it's the sequel to the Adam Sandler, Jennifer Aniston movie, Murder Mystery, that came out a few years ago. It's just a fun adventure, sort of. There's a little bit of a whodunit and, action comedy sort of stuff going on, but it's just a fun, light sort of movie that's readily available for anybody who has a Netflix account. So that's my recommendation.
I like that. It's funny. I just watched, it was Adam Sandler just got the Mark Twain Award.
Oh, yeah.
And it was really great to see like how loved he is by the people that like work with him and spend time with him. So like that was kind of a nice thing.
That's great.
So I'm recommending a new movie that just came out. It's called Renfield. I was on the fence about whether or not to see this, but I'm also at that stage where I'm like, I know that like Nicolas Cage is just going to be ridiculous in whatever he wants to be in. And so I was kind of like, that was my selling point, is Nicolas Cage as Dracula.
Sure.
I will say I went in with very low expectations and thoroughly enjoyed it.
Nice.
So if you're not familiar with the story is Renfield, Dracula's assistant, who is his familiar. He has powers from eating insects.
Okay.
And so, like, that's one of the lore is, like, when he eats small animals, he gains, like, similar superhuman powers. And he has continued to keep Dracula alive for all these years, Dracula being Nicolas Cage. And there are moments where you see, Nicolas Cage coming through. It's Nicolas Cage just being Nicolas Cage, but dressed up like Dracula sometimes.
Okay.
And it's very funny. And it took a turn that I was not expecting, which the turn was, it's very John Wicky.
Okay.
Nicholas Hoult is great as Renfield and just beats the crap out of a lot of people for a very long time. And the story is kind of interesting. And then Awkwafina is in it as well. And she's very funny. So if you don't know her work, she was in Shang-Chi.
Yeah.
She was like the co-star in Shang-Chi, and she was great in it. So
yeah,
it's a great watch. It's a lot of fun. So I definitely recommend it.
Okay, so this isn't actually tied into like any of the big like tentpole universes. This is just sort of its own fun side movie.
Yeah, 100%. And it's wonderful.
Cool. All right, great. Well, if you would like to tell us about a movie you've been enjoying as recent, or would like to tell us something about pledging allegiance, or if you pledge allegiance in another country that we missed, or you think it's weird that we do it here and you want to agree with something else that we said, you should do that. You can always give us some constructive criticism, and that's okay too. But we also look forward to that praise. You can reach us directly by emailing us at info@wwd.podcast.com or on our social media platforms. We're on the normal-ish ones. The other way you can support us is by picking up some merch by heading over to our merch store. We've got all kinds of good stuff there. You can leave us a rating and review and subscribe. Tell a friend about us. And there's a group of people who have really helped us continue our journey here, our Patreon supporters. And we're continuing to run our campaign that if we get up to 15 patron supporters, we're going to do a virtual hangout with all of them, and it will be a good time. And if we get up to 20, then we'll do an even more structured, fun hangout. We're actually getting close. We're closing the gap. We're almost there. Thank you to the people who have joined us recently on Patreon, so you can help us get there, and we would love to meet all of you and chat with you. We're trying to run this through about June, so if you join us before then, that would be great. Which you can find more information about at patreon.com/WWDWWD podcast. And there you can find out like all the different tiers and the perks that you get for joining us. And that group of people includes some wonderfuls that we just are so thankful toward: Mike M, Megan, Layla, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, the Daily BA, Brad, Stephanie, Kelly, Olivia, and Brian. Thank you all for your support and helping make this podcast what it is. You are the best.
Yes, we love you so much.
All right. Also, music and editing by Justin Greenhouse, writing and fact-checking by Shane, Selena, Jess, and myself. Thank you all so much for listening. We couldn't do it without you. Is there anything that I missed or anything you'd like to add before we wrap up, Shane?
No, I think that's good. I think that works.
Perfect. All right. I pledge allegiance to the end of this episode. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
And I salute.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do.
You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.